All right. So, hey guys and girls, thanks you very much for tuning in to our end of March, April 2023 powerlifting Q&A. We're going to go through a few questions. Of course, as always, priorities given to anybody who's on the call live. If you got a question, you can just submit your question through the chat and I'll bring you on and try to answer your question as best as possible. Otherwise, we'll get started with any questions that people submitted beforehand. So, with that said, we'll get started with some of our pre-submitted questions. Then anybody that's on live, just drop in the chat and I'll answer as we go, okay? So first question that we've got comes from Lee. His question is not as much about lifts, but more how to best deal with the fear of re-injury. This is something he's struggled with for the past 12 months or so since he originally injured his knee. So I talked with Lee a little bit, and from what I can gather, his knee is technically fine now. He's able to train fairly consistently and fairly heavily, but it's always just something that's just sort of eating at him, always in the back of his mind. So I like to come at injury rehab from really two main perspectives when we're talking about something like this. The first is physical side of things. And so this is where making sure that you've done proper physio and rehab is going to be really important, not rushing that and making sure that physically the structures are very robust. That stuff is pretty simple by itself. A couple things that are maybe often overlooked is looking at the mechanism of injury as well, right? So if we're talking about stuff that might happen in the gym where you get injured on a squat, for example, and you injure your knee doing a squat, if your quad tendon, you experience a strain in that. I'll just paint an example here because I don't have the details of these knee injury. But let's say you strain your quad tendon. And if we look at the rehab process, we want to get that strong again and make sure that it's as strong or stronger than it previously was. But then the second thing we want to look at within the muscular side of things is actually making sure that we've addressed the mechanism of injury as well. So this could be, for example, a muscular imbalance where the quads are compensating for a lack of strength elsewhere, or it could be maybe a technical issue where somebody's unable to load their hips properly. And as such, they continuously put a disproportionate amount of strain on their knees because they're not loading their hips, which are a bigger joint, in that squat, right? So from a physical standpoint, make sure that you're addressing the tissues that were injured, you're addressing the joints that were injured, of course, but then look at the mechanism of injury and challenge that to make sure that you're moving in the most efficient way possible for yourself, right? So that's the physical side of things. The second is the mental, which it really sounds like Lee is struggling with the most here. And it's that fear in the back of your head of re-injury. So I genuinely believe that if you've done step number one, the physical side of the rehab process, you're off to a pretty good start. If you're at a point where you can train pretty regularly and fairly heavy, right? Meaning, normal training intensity, 70, 75, even 80% of your max. If you can train at those intensities, odds are that tissue is strong enough to train with a progressive overload fashion, right? So again, from a psychological standpoint, just understanding that fact that, hey, if you can train at normal training intensities, you're probably going to be okay pushing the weights a little bit and just, making sure you're not being foolish with your programming and gradually increasing the stress of the training and allowing for enough recovery. That'll be a good thing. The other thing that can really help is just the passage of time. And you get repeated exposures and just consciously identifying and acknowledging that, hey, you know what? I squatted 80% again today for the 15th time without pain. Or my knee was a little tight, but it didn't really manifest anything past tightness in my warm-ups. And once I was in my working sets, it was fine. And just consciously registering those things and either verbalizing it or writing it down, not just thinking it internally, can be a really beneficial tool if we've assumed that the structures themselves are fine, the technique and mechanism of injury has been sorted out, and it's more just you getting in your own head about something, right? So again, there's a lot of steps you got to take before you can pay attention to that, but these are things that can be done concurrently, the physical and the mental sides to getting over an injury physically and mentally, right? So Lee, I hope that helps out. But yeah, let me know if you got any follow-up questions there. Next question we've got is from Sumir, and she asks, deloading suggestions before going back to a volume block. I'll try to answer this question as best as I can. Again, for these Q&As, it's sometimes a little tough for me because I'll get varying levels of detail in the questions. But typically speaking, if I've got somebody who's going back into a volume block, it's generally going to be after some kind of a lower volume phase, like a strength or peaking phase. Everybody's going to be a little bit different, but as some general suggestions, I like to include the same lifts as what I was training previously. I'm not a big fan of, for the most part, including new lifts on a deload week. Overall volume, so sets times reps times weight, if you calculate that figure, should be put to about half. And depending on the lifter, if you're kind of an average weight class, so any of the popular ones as a male or female, so kind of like 75 kilos for females, 84 kilos for men in terms of sort of really popular weight classes, you're probably going to be okay with just going with a couple light sessions. So taking that intensity down to about 50 to 70% of what you did, keep your lift selection the same, and make sure that once you've accounted for the adjustment in intensity, so if you were squatting 100 kilos going down to 70 kilos or 50, right, that volume figure works out to around half. And then coming back to it about a week later and jumping into week 1 of your block. The other thing that I found really useful is with smaller lifters or lifters who just aren't as strong, or they're not as developed in their powerlifting career, is just simply dropping volume. So if you're finding that you're somebody who basically you're not at a national level, for example, it might be less than that. Everyone's going to recover a little bit differently. Maintaining intensity, but getting your volume reduction by actually dropping your reps in half can be a really beneficial way, just because less experienced lifters will detrain more quickly. And so here's how this example might look. So if you have that same lifter who's squatting 100 kilos, we'll say, for sets of 6 in their previous phase of training, we might have them do 100 or 105 kilos, whatever that sort of next week's programmed weights would have hypothetically been, but do it for 3 reps instead. Now that's going to, of course, make for the sets to be much easier, because doing it for half the reps will leave you with a lot more in the tank. And so your proximity to failure will become lower. The training itself will become less stressful. And of course, doing half the reps will lead to about half the volume. This is one where, again, if you tend to dissipate fatigue fairly quickly and fairly easily, this is a really good strategy to go with. And additionally, if you're somebody that tends to come off of deload weeks and feel kind of detrained or deconditioned, where those heavy weights feel really heavy, disproportionately so, this can be a really good sort of intermediate strategy where you can still get some exposure to those heavy weights, but at the same time, you're able to dissipate a lot of fatigue. And frankly, volume is going to be the biggest thing, or biggest single item in training that has an impact on fatigue levels. There's a lot of other things, but that is, if I was going to pick one thing, that will be the thing that has the biggest impact. Patrick asks, coming back from an injury, how to basically get back into it. Any suggestions in terms of stretches? Yeah, it's a bit of a limited thing. Basically, Patrick has said he didn't do any physician input, starting very light, watching his form, mostly does squats and deadlifts. It's a tough question because I don't have a lot of detail. Generally speaking, what I'm not going to do right now is prescribe an exercise program with no detail and no assessment done. What I recommend doing in general terms is what you're doing. Start light, increase progressively, keep an eye on soreness. And if you're finding that anything is lingering for more than about a day, you probably want to back off a little bit. If you're getting some mild soreness that clears up within about 24 hours of a workout, you're probably okay. And if it holds steady or dissipates over the course of a workout, again, you're probably okay. Whereas if you have that, the aches, pains, injury sensation that increases over the course of the workout, you're probably overdoing it. Again, these are general terms. This is not me prescribing you an exercise program. This is just my general thinking on how I would approach things in a general format for coming back from an injury and getting into something. Okay, So making pretty good time going through some of these questions today. Again, if anybody here has questions, you can just drop them in the chat and I will answer it as much as possible. So we have one here. So Dylan asks, question number 1, AMRAPs, myoreps, or reps till failure? How often can you do this before you start to backslide? Okay, so those are 3 modalities that I think are they get used in different scenarios. So AMRAPs can be used, with accessory work or main work. Myoreps and reps till failure can be used for main work. I'm not a big fan of using it with big compound movements just because the levels of fatigue the acute levels of fatigue will be very high, and so form breakdown is quite likely. Whereas using machine or single joint movements, these myoreps and total reps are a really more viable strategy because there's less stability demand and less risk that you carry with it, frankly. How long can you use them before you start to backslide? Those aren't going to be the things that will cause you to backslide or progress, right? You have to look bigger picture at how frequently are you doing these things? How many sets and reps are you doing? Is this something where you're doing 1 round on something, as opposed to if you have 4 sets of squats, you might do 3 sets of X reps and then finish with an AMRAP. That's one way of doing an AMRAP, and I think that's a pretty viable thing to keep in for a fairly long term, especially if you're fluctuating how close to failure you're going on things like those AMRAPs. On the other hand, if you're saying, hey, I'm going to do as many reps as I can for all 4 sets of my squats, if you're getting reasonably close to failure and past that beginner stage, you'll probably start to backslide sooner than later. Ultimately, the answer is a bit different for everybody. If you're still getting stronger every week and you're adding reps or adding weight, it's moving, and keep doing it. And then if you're not, or you start to have weeks back to back where you're backsliding, then that's that. And most people are going to land in that about 3 to 8 week range. It depends. I hope that helps answer the question a little bit. So AMRAP compound and myo for smaller movements or accessories. Yeah, exactly. I don't think the going repeated low rep sets close to failure, really close together, like you would for a myo rep set, is a good strategy for most people in the barbell compound movements. Number 2 question from Dylan here is adding back off or typical hypertrophy sets, so things like 3 sets of 10, supersets, that kind of stuff, of primary accessory movements after main sets. So in other words, more bench, how much can one get away with in terms of volume and percentage and still recover for next week's main lift day? Or do you throw it in on a light day? So I think if I'm understanding this correctly, you're asking, should you be adding in more back off and higher rep work on your main day, or should it be added in on a second or third day as kind of a separate workout? I think it depends on the phase of training you're in, and it's going to depend on phase of training you're in and obviously overall goals. So we'll take this in a powerlifting context because that's what the group is about. I'm a big fan of having higher rep work for a couple reasons. So higher rep barbell work. So if I did, top set on bench, barbell bench press, and I'm going to do, some 3 sets of 10 with, again, a barbell bench press. I'm a big fan of that just to build up some workload. Often I'm a fan of having that as well for just getting an opportunity to have lower intensities, for lower percentages of your max on the bar to develop technique. There's a case for using heavy stuff for technique, but that's a separate discussion. And additionally, of course, in volume phases and stuff like that, most lifters should be doing more than 1 heavy session or more than 1 overloading style session a week. So the way that within a powerlifting program, I'll use some higher rep work is I might have somebody do their main day for the week. So if you have your main bench day and you're working up to some heavy sets of 5, for example, I might have them do a 5s, back downs with some more 5s on their regular bench, do a smaller exercise for higher reps that day. And then on their second bench day, assuming it's appropriate for the phase of training and all that, I would have them go load up a barbell bench for higher reps and have it be more of a rep type day where things are a little lighter. And then if, again, they need more volume after that in order to grow or progress, again, this is very dependent on the lifter, then I would go and add in, again, another smaller exercise or accessory exercise to beef up the reps and volume for the week a little bit further. And, you can scale this over 2 sessions, 3 sessions, 4 sessions a week, depending on what kind of frequency you're using for the lift. If you have any other follow-up questions. Yeah, groovy. Perfect. Okay. What else do we have here? So next we've got Charles. Charles asks, do I mix hypertrophy blocks into my training? If yes, how often? Yeah, hypertrophy blocks are really important. The easiest way to think about this is if you're building a car and you put a 1 liter engine into it, or you put an 8-liter engine into it, I don't care how well you tune that 1 liter engine, you're never going to make it go as fast as that 8-liter engine could possibly go, right? So that engine is your muscle mass, or how much lean mass you're bringing to the table. If you walk around at 200 pounds and 30% body fat, and you've got 140 pounds of lean mass, or you walk around at 200 pounds and 10% body fat, and you're walking around with 180 pounds of muscle, your potential for being stronger is higher at 180 pounds than it is at 140 pounds of lean mass, right? It's not to say people should be walking around as ripped, shredded skeletons, but if we just do some basic math, we can calculate your potential, and it's relative. Somebody with 150 pounds of lean mass might actually be stronger than somebody at 180, but there's so many other factors at play. What you can control is you. And back on track to answer your question here. Big fan of hypertrophy blocks. Muscle growth is slow. Progressive overload over time, just getting stronger for the beginner and intermediate phases, will generally yield some hypertrophy by itself. And generally, as I see lifters start to get into that sort of mid to late intermediate phase, is where I'll start to have more dedicated hypertrophy blocks. If the goal is powerlifting long term, I'm typically going to keep some heavy work in there somewhere, whether that be even just some submaximal singles, doubles, or triples, where we're able to keep in the rhythm and in the groove of doing some heavy work, but not have it be super close to a max. And what that lets us do is, again, you can stay in the rhythm, where when you go back to a strength block, it's not this big shock to the system and you don't spend a few weeks getting into the rhythm again. But at the same time, it's not so taxing that, if we were trying to do a bunch of volume in a strength block, for example, where you would just burn yourself out and you'd probably become a pile of bones and tendons before you actually did anything meaningful with really high volume strength block. So I like them. They have their place. Generally for mid to late intermediates and on is where I'll start to add them in, adding in some heavy singles, doubles, or triples at a sub-maximal, 1 or 2 in the tank type intensity. Most people, that's going to be in that 85 to 92% for the most part. All right. Next question comes from Nico, and he asks, what are some good resources to learn more about mobility and imbalances related to barbell training? Books or media worth looking into? So I've got some free stuff that I can send you, and I'll refer to a couple other things as well, but I have a full ebook that covers how to program accessory work for both mobility and muscle gain, and how to identify how much you need and where it should go. If you're watching this on a replay, you can just comment ebook and I'll send it over to you. Nico, I'll send you a copy of this. I've got your contact info, I'll send it over. Some other places that I've learned a lot from are Connor Harris. So he's got Instagram, website, YouTube, pretty popular guy on socials, but he's had a lot of influence on how I program mobility training. It's been, what I really like about Connor's approach to things is he uses basically a test retest on everything and says, instead of just arbitrarily saying you should go do this exercise, he says, okay, let's try X exercise for you. Here's some objective tests that we can do to establish if it's working or not. So we test before, try the exercise, and come back to it and retest. And if we see an improvement in mobility or movement function, well, then we know this exercise is worth keeping in rotation as it pertains to mobility and movement quality, right? So Connor Harris is a really, really good one. He's got some paid courses. He's got a lot of free content, definitely worth checking out. Some other ones that have been useful for mobility, Postural Restoration Institute, PRI, has been really good. They do more course stuff. There's not a lot of free content out there for that. There's a guy called Bill Hartman who has, I'd say, takes a very heavy PRI influence. So if you want to go into the weeds, Bill Hartman is a good one. In terms of things that are maybe a little bit more accessible, RTS manual, it's a bit of a throwback, but that's $30 or something like that. And that's a pretty good read in terms of not just programming accessory stuff, but really making everything sort of fit into a program. And Mike Teixeira is good on auto regulation and, you know, making the program work for the lifter, basically. I could go on a pretty big tangent, frankly, about places to learn and resources to go through. I've got a whole list made up. I just don't know where it is right now. Those are the ones that come to the top of mind. So Connor Harris, Bill Hartman, PRI, and a lot of the RTS stuff is good. There might not be as much accessory stuff in there, but worthwhile to look into nonetheless. And then, of course, my ebook that covers all of that. It's literally called the Definitive Powerlifting Accessory Work Manual. Very on the nose name, but it'll do what it says it's supposed to help you learn more about. Okay, and I think that's it for questions right now. I'm not seeing any more. So unless anybody else has some questions in here, I think we can wrap up for today. I'll give everything a couple minutes. If any of you guys and girls have questions, just drop them into the chat. And other than that, we'll call it a day. There are about one or two more questions here. Okay, where did it go? Powerlifting Q&A. Yeah, so I've got a question here from Michael. He's had a hernia, so he's 5 weeks out post-operation and wondering what he should do to get back into routine. So free weights or machine type exercises. Hernia was in the groin area, so sounds like probably an inguinal hernia. Again, this is not medical advice. Listen to your doctor, listen to your physio. I'm assuming 5 weeks out, you've probably done some physio stuff at this point to recover. I've worked with a few lifters who've had hernias in the past, and there's a couple things past, you know, just standard graded exposure, like we had talked about earlier today, that I found very beneficial. So graded exposure being, you know, start light, gradually work your way up, right? I haven't really found any hard and fast rules about free weights versus machines. It's different things will work for different people at those earlier stages of getting back into training. What I've found really, really useful is identifying the ability, or building the ability, I should say, to do a complete and full 360 brace. So typically this is something that I like to teach from the ground up, and I'll just pull up the video to show you here. Give me half a second. Bracing sequence. Here we go. But basically, if you can feel how to actually expand, that will make a pretty big difference in how well you can avoid overstressing just one area. Here's the video I'm looking for. So share this video. Where did we go? Share screen. Boom, boom. So potato quality here doesn't matter too much, but basically I like to start teaching this with feet up on a stool. Hands will generally go around the waist, and we're trying to just simply get people to feel their ability to feel their abs, right? So you want to be able to feel not just your front abs, right? Your belly button push out, but if you take your fingers and stick them inside your hip bones, When you brace, that should push out as well. If you take your thumbs and put them on top of your hip bones on the sides of your waist, when you brace and you breathe in, that should push out laterally as well. And then if you take your thumbs and put them behind your back by your kidneys and you breathe in and brace, that should push out as well. And so everything will kind of expand as if you've inflated a bit of an airbag in your torso, if you will. It'll feel solid. It won't feel like you've distended your gut or anything like that. But starting laying on your back is a really good place to learn this, just because gravity is not a factor, right? You don't have to brace or control your posture at all because you're laying on the ground. From there, working your way off the ground, so going from your back to your hands and knees into standing while still trying to keep that brace it's not sexy, but it's a pretty critical component to really developing a good foundational brace. And in my experience, has been really good at avoiding recurring issues with hernias with the lifters that I've worked with. Again, your mileage may vary. Listen to your doctor. You know the drill. All right, guys and girls, I think that's it. I don't have any other questions sitting in the chat or in the pre-posted questions. Thank you very much for tuning in. Again, if you want a copy of that ebook on how to program powerlifting accessory work for mobility, injury prevention, and muscle gain, you can just comment ebook in the comments on the website or Facebook group where this replay will be. And other than that, see you on the next one.